Well, thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I'm very pleased to be able to speak on these appropriations bills today, representing, as they do, a very central part of government, the need to appropriate money to run the activities of the government. And the word appropriation, in a sense, Deputy Speaker, is quite relevant because it's a strong word. To appropriate, it means to take. And the reality is that what governments do is through the force of law, say to their citizens that they are required to pay certain amounts through taxation and then seek to use those funds for the betterment of the community. But it is done through the force of law. It is something that members of our community are required to do, to comply with government rules about taxation and so on. And as a result, it is incredibly important that when we do appropriate money from the people and businesses of Australia, that we use that money wisely, Deputy Speaker, because it can't be morally right to take money from the people of Australia unless we are using that money in the most sensible possible fashion. And there is an immense contrast here, Deputy Speaker, because of course under the previous government the levels of appropriation rose to record amounts, and the inefficiency with which that money was spent also rose to record levels. Now, my electorate of Banks, Deputy Speaker, has many characteristics, but one of the characteristics is people in my electorate do not like to see their money wasted, Deputy Speaker. They absolutely accept the need to pay tax, to contribute to the caring for people less fortunate in our society and the many other things that government does. But what they do object to, Deputy Speaker, and rightly so, what they do object to is when that money is wasted or used in a bad way. And that's exactly what happened under the previous government. So what I wanted to do this morning, Deputy Speaker, is talk a bit about where we've come from in the past, in the 6 years of the Labor government, where we are now with respect to the use of government money, and where we might go back to should the ALP ever come back into power, because the opening salvo, as the Shadow Treasurer described it in the battle of ideas, has been launched in the form of tax number one from the ALP in recent weeks, and I think it's important to reflect a little on those, on what might happen there, which I'll do in a moment. But let's talk a bit about the evidence of the 6 years of Labor. Now, one thing that's extraordinarily consistent, Deputy Speaker, is in every year of ALP budgets, they actually ended up having to appropriate more money than they forecast they would. So every single budget, Deputy Speaker, they said they would need a certain amount of money. They actually ended up taking more every time. And the amounts varied. 2009-10, they were only out by $1 billion. Thought it would be $338 billion. It was actually $339. So you know what's a billion between friends, Deputy Speaker. Then there was 2010-11. They were out by $1.5 billion. They thought it'd be 354.6. It was actually 356.1. In 2012-13, Deputy Speaker, they just got it wrong by $6.3 billion that year. So they thought it was going to be 376. It was actually 382. Then 2011-12 wasn't so good, Deputy Speaker. They got that one wrong by nearly $12 billion. They said in the budget they'd spend $365.8 billion. They actually spent $377.7. So $12 billion difference, which is quite extraordinary. In 2008-9, Deputy Speaker, which won the award here, they projected that they would spend $292 billion, actually spent $324. So actually spent $32 billion more than they had forecast in their own budget. So every single time they spent more than they had said they would, and that is a very consistent theme and sends a very clear message about the manner in which they manage the budget. Now, I want to move, Deputy Speaker, to a small indicative example of budget management under the previous government. And this concerns a relatively small program, and a program in an area which is an important area of public policy, Deputy Speaker, in the area of dementia. And the Labor Party said when they were in government that they would introduce a dementia supplement to assist people suffering from that condition, and clearly on both sides of the House, Deputy Speaker, we would acknowledge the importance of providing assistance where we can to people in that situation. But they described Jacinta Collins, the senator who had responsibility for this, described these as historic reforms, most substantial reforms to Australia's aged care system in a generation, and followed extensive community consultation. Well, Deputy Speaker, the consultation must have been, at least to some extent, inadequate, because Senator Collins thought that this would cost $11.7 million in 2013-14. It actually cost 135. 135. So, Deputy Speaker, it's about what's that? About 11 times. About 11 times. So, just dramatically out, Deputy Speaker, and really speaks to this issue of having the capacity to plan in a sensible way and to understand operations, to understand how things will actually play out in the real world, as opposed to being able to issue a press release. But that is a damning indictment, Deputy Speaker. They thought it would cost $12 million. It cost $135 million, and that's, in the scheme of the federal budget, a relatively small amount. But there were so many of these examples right across the previous government's unhappy tenure. Now, Deputy Speaker, the good news is, and we now have a government in place which is managing the funds of Australia in a much better fashion, and the evidence of that is very clear. Now, let's have a look at immigration, Deputy Speaker. Now, of course, there was an extraordinary blowout in immigration costs under the previous government. The key reason for that, there's a lot of things in the immigration portfolio, Deputy Speaker, but the key reason for the blowout was the complete loss of control of Australia's borders. $11 billion, 50,000 people arriving, and of course the tragic humanitarian consequences of that policy. But under this government, Deputy Speaker, the cost of the immigration portfolio is declining. It's coming down substantially. So $4.4 billion in 2014, Deputy Speaker. In the current year, it comes down to $4.2 billion. It's expected to come down to 3.5 the year after that, 3 billion the year after that, and 2.8 billion in 2017-18. And the reason that can happen is because of the very effective stewardship of the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection, the previous, and indeed the new minister as well. That's an extraordinary contrast. So completely out of control in a humanitarian and financial sense under the previous government, and very firmly under control through the strong management of the current government. We see the same thing in the NBN, Deputy Speaker. Now, when they write the sort of history, someone will inevitably have the job of chronicling the 6 years of the Gillard-Rudd years in some detail. And when they do that, someone is going to have to write a very, very lengthy chapter about the NBN, Deputy Speaker. Very lengthy chapter. Because the mismanagement and just rank amateurism that we've seen in the planning and at the NBN really is in a class of its own. Now, what we saw, of course, Deputy Speaker, is it was originally, they said, going to cost about $10 billion, and the government was going to put in $4.7 billion. Then they said, well, no, actually, sorry, it's going to cost $43 billion, but private investors are going to put up 49% of that, which didn't happen. So it was going to be in there with $43 billion. That's a big increase from 10 to 43. Then, when we conducted a proper and thorough review of this, Deputy Speaker, it was soon after coming into government, it turned out that it was on track to be about $72 billion. So it's a lot more than 10. A lot more than 10, Deputy Speaker, 72. And then, this is a particularly interesting point, Deputy Speaker, that estimate of $73 billion was based on the assumption that it would cost about $2,200 to $2,500 per premise to actually wire up each premise with the fibre to the premise strategy. Now, the Senate estimates, I think this was just last week, Deputy Speaker, or certainly in the last couple of weeks, it turns out that it was actually costing $4,300 per premise, not $2,500. So you had $73 billion on the assumption it'd be about $2,500 per home. It was actually $4,300 per home. And that means, Deputy Speaker, that even that estimate of $73 billion was low. So a program which was supposed to cost the taxpayer originally $4.7 billion was on track to cost well in excess of $73 billion. And that is just absolutely scandalous, Deputy Speaker. And of course, what we are seeing under the Minister for Communications, so ably assisted by his Parliamentary Secretary, is a much more sensible rollout, Deputy Speaker, a rollout that actually makes use of a range of technologies, not just one, because there are lots of different ways of getting high-speed broadband to the home, and at a much, much lower cost, Deputy Speaker. And importantly, it's actually happening. We're not saying construction's commenced when there's simply a piece of paper where someone would like construction to have commenced. Construction's commenced if construction has actually commenced. So a very, very important contrast, Deputy Speaker. And of course, infrastructure is another one. Not a lot happened under the previous government in infrastructure. In the M5, particularly the M5 East, big issue in my electorate of Banks, Deputy Speaker, traffic. I don't know if you've ever travelled on the M5 East in Sydney, but if you have, it can be a very unpleasant experience, Deputy Speaker. And the previous government said that they would provide some funding to the New South Wales government to help build the M5 East, but with a whole range of completely untenable conditions, and as a consequence it didn't happen. No money was provided. Now this government, under the leadership of the Prime Minister, said if you commit to building productivity-enhancing infrastructure, we will back you. We will back you 100%. So $1.5 billion of cash, plus a concessional loan of $2 billion. And what that has meant, Deputy Speaker, is the M5 East duplication, and it's actually more than a duplication because it's going to go from 4 lanes to 10, is actually happening. It's actually happening, Deputy Speaker. And that duplication we expect to be in place in 2019, which is a fantastic improvement and a good example, Deputy Speaker, of when you appropriate money for the purpose of running a government, Deputy Speaker, you must do so cautiously and carefully, but to appropriate money for the purpose of building infrastructure that A, helps business to do business more quickly, and B, helps people to spend more time with their families, that is a very, very sensible appropriation indeed. Now, Deputy Speaker, the third thing I wanted to talk about is what happens under the alternative model, Deputy Speaker. And there were some very illuminating newspaper articles and various comments made, particularly in January, Deputy Speaker, where the opposition was surprisingly open, actually, about its plans. Now, the Shadow Treasurer said very clearly revenue measures are on the table. So part of the year of ideas, I suspect pretty much all of the year of ideas, will be so-called revenue measures. Generally, that means tax increase, Deputy Speaker. Revenue measure sounds a bit better, but basically a tax increase. And on the 27th of January, the Shadow Assistant Treasurer wrote this fascinating op-ed in The Australian, where he really sort of wept at the grave of the carbon and mining taxes, really lamented their demise, Deputy Speaker. And he said that the Abbott government has thrown out significant sources of revenue like the carbon price and the mining tax, and he actually provided some advice to the Assistant Treasurer, where he said that Mr Frydenberg should be pressing his colleagues to reconsider some of their decisions related to the carbon tax and the mining tax. Now, I'm very confident the Assistant Treasurer won't take that advice, Deputy Speaker, because it's very, very poor advice indeed, because these were job-killing taxes, Deputy Speaker, and significantly increased the cost of household living expenses, Deputy Speaker. So the opposition has been clear to say revenue measures are coming. So there's going to be a whole range of announcements we can assume about revenue measures and tax increases, Deputy Speaker. And we had the first one this week, and this was a somewhat complex issue, Deputy Speaker, but relates to the capitalisation rules for foreign entities. And big headlines, going to raise $2 billion. Would raise absolutely nothing of the sort, Deputy Speaker. It was described by the Shadow Treasurer as the opening salvo in the battle of ideas, Deputy Speaker. So quite a grand pronouncement, but that is a salvo from a very small pop gun, Deputy Speaker, a very small pop gun, because this proposal, as the Business Council of Australia said, this has the potential to slow economic growth and further diminish Australia's competitiveness. Chamber of Commerce and Industry said it has potential to make Australia a less attractive place for international investment, thereby pushing new projects offshore and hurting jobs. And that can't be. It can't be a sensible thing, Deputy Speaker. So we do wait with interest for the year of ideas, Deputy Speaker. I'm very confident that the vast majority of the ideas will be new taxes leading to further appropriations of money from the Australian people and Australian companies, and that is the wrong path and this government has demonstrated the right way to manage the nation's finances.
The question.